Hello and welcome to our webinar, Managing Innovation's Productive Tensions. I'm Elizabeth Heichler, Editorial Director at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator. Corporate innovation is a game with tough odds to beat. 3 out of 4 new product releases fail to gain traction in the marketplace. In their new book, Productive Tensions, How Every Leader Can Tackle Innovation's Toughest Trade-Offs, Chris Bingham and Rory McDonald point out why successful innovation is so difficult. It requires leaders to decide how best to manage competing aims, such as whether to pursue efficiency or flexibility, consistency or change, product or purpose. Chris and Rory are here with us today to walk us through the 8 clarifying questions at the heart of their book and provide leaders with advice about how to skillfully adapt to today's dynamic environments. Chris is the Philip Heddleman Distinguished Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship and Area Chair of Strategy and Entrepreneurship and Faculty Director of the Entrepreneurship Center at the University of North Carolina's Kenan-Flagler Business School. Rory is the Tai T. Lee Associate Professor of Business Administration in the Technology and Operations Management Unit at Harvard Business School. Welcome, Chris and Rory.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to everyone joining with us today. We know how busy you are as leaders, so really appreciate your time. We want to begin with a key question that is likely very relevant to you. Why is leading innovation so distressingly hit or miss? Now, don't worry about writing an answer in the questions module, but rather think about why innovation has been so frustrating for you and the people you work with. More than 90% of high potential ventures fail to meet projected targets, while roughly 75% of the products released each year bomb. Few established organizations remain dominant over time as revitalization efforts fail or backfire, costing time and money and creating openings for competitors. Even fewer generate above average shareholder returns for more than a couple of years. These failures are often attributed to a lack of money, talent, or luck. But we think it is that innovation in dynamic environments, those characterized by novelty, resource constraints, and uncertainty, is rife with critical tensions. When left unaddressed or mishandled, these tensions sink teams and organizations. Until now, there's been little focus on these tensions in practice or theory, leaving leaders blind to their existence and without the rigorous approaches needed to successfully manage them. Our forthcoming book, Productive Tensions, helps address this shortcoming. Our purpose today is to shine a spotlight on 8 questions that every innovation leader must correctly answer. We also provide practical guidance for harnessing the tension that underlies each question. One key question is, should you be flexible or disciplined when capturing growth opportunities? A small US-based security software company received a call from a customer prospect in Germany. To capture the business and meet cash demands, the company chose to enter the German market. It subsequently entered additional overseas markets in a similar manner. It was more like we were drawn in rather than made a conscious decision, a company executive told us. Seizing opportunities as they arise is consistent with the conventional wisdom that companies must move quickly in dynamic markets. But there's an underlying tension here. Acting fast leaves less time for deliberation, so companies can easily end up with an incoherent portfolio of mismatched opportunities. A disciplined approach, by contrast, enables strategic alignment and sets a path for future opportunities, but it can come at the cost of some quick wins. Our research with successful organizations shows how to resolve the tension. During the opportunity selection phase, it's better to be disciplined, spending time studying prospects and devising a plan to capture the best ones, rather than those that are easiest to attain. In this way, an organization can accumulate knowledge and expertise, using early opportunities to build a foundation for more strategic ones later on. During the opportunity execution phase, more flexibility leads to greater success. This helps organizations abandon ineffective products and practices and adopt more appropriate ones. Increased discipline in opportunity selection creates a foundation for increased flexibility during execution. That's because more discipline in selection usually reduces the need to rationalize faulty choices later, freeing leaders to approach execution in a more open-minded way. Conversely, when leaders take opportunities as they arise, they exhibit a strong tendency to defend their past choices and become more rigid in the way they execute opportunities. A Singapore gaming company offers a good example of being disciplined first and flexible later. The company took its time conducting customer interviews and studying market adoption trends before choosing Japan as the first market to enter in its global expansion. When it executed this opportunity, however, it quickly discovered that its plan to sell digital content to Japanese wireless providers meant going head-to-head with entrenched Japanese companies. Once managers realized this, they changed their plan to partner with the entrenched competitors in Japan to sell their content throughout Asia. Their flexibility yielded far greater results than the original execution plan.
A second question, is it better to differentiate your offering or borrow ideas from competitors? Now, in established markets, the essence of strategy is choosing to perform activities differently from the way rivals do. In nascent markets, however, this approach makes little sense. When a market or business category is still forming, leaders often don't know who their buyers, suppliers, or competitors will be, much less which points of distinctiveness are likely to matter to would-be customers. The tension underlying this dilemma is rooted in the choice between developing a well-differentiated offering and borrowing ideas that work from competitors. The trade-offs are straightforward. Borrowing is faster and often cheaper and easier, but it doesn't result in a unique offering. Going for differentiation sets a new product or service apart, but it is time-consuming, resource-intensive, and customer demand is uncertain. Organizational leaders can harness this tension by engaging in parallel play, a practice inspired by preschool-aged children. Here's how parallel play unfolds in various stages of innovation. Early on, put aside differentiation, borrow ideas instead. Young children playing side by side imitate each other and borrow each other's toys, but they rarely play together or try to outdo each other. A similar dynamic occurred in the early days of the ride-sharing market. When sidecars switched to letting drivers use their own cars and offered an app that featured electronic payments, GPS navigation, and driver ratings, Zimride, later Lyft, and Uber followed suit. Next, test relentlessly and then commit. When young children play, they usually explore various projects and then stick with one that engages them most. Similarly, we found that high-performing organizations don't just borrow ideas, they test ideas and learn from market feedback. Then they use that learning to develop a lucrative business model for creating and capturing value and spend scarce resources only on it. Bourbon is a good example. When an early version of the app, which enabled users to connect, arrange meetups, and post photos, proved too complicated, founder Kevin Systrom investigated what users really wanted. What he discovered led to a new business focused solely on easy photo sharing, renamed Instagram. Finally, pause, observe, and refine. Often preschoolers at play pause to reflect on their projects before continuing. Leaders we studied acted similarly by initially specifying basic elements of their business models. For example, a product that customers will find superior to existing solutions, while leaving other elements undefined, for example, distribution. Early on, Dropbox committed to an easy-to-use product and a free-to-paid tiered model for capturing value. But it stopped short of tailoring the offering to consumers who were Dropbox's primary users at the time, and building operations around file backup, which was the service's original and most common use case. This robust but underdetermined model enabled Dropbox to add additional services such as file sharing and collaboration, and led profitable new enterprise customers to come on board. By the time it filed to go public in 2018, almost a third of its 11 million subscribers were on a Dropbox business team plan.
Thanks, Rory. That was a great question. Here's another one for you. When do you seek internal help or external help? Innovators need each other's help. Alone leaders are subject to information processing limitations. Their information is incomplete, and what they know is affected by cognitive bias. Left unaddressed, these shortcomings can result in poor outcomes for individuals, teams, and organizations. Using crowds or the people around us is an effective way to overcome the inherent limitations of individual cognitive processing, especially in entrepreneurial settings where leaders must make swift decisions to address the key uncertainties associated with innovation. But when should leaders seek the advice of crowds inside the organization? And when should they seek the advice of crowds outside the organization? The key to resolving this tension is understanding when and how to source internal and external crowds using a novel strategic framework we call crowd sequencing. Crowd sequencing consists of 3 steps. First, use external crowds to address problem uncertainty. Leaders are constantly bombarded with issues, all of which seem to require attention and resources. But often they have an incomplete or inaccurate picture of what's going on, such that it's difficult to know if they are focusing on the right problems. They typically rely on focus groups of knowledgeable consumers to overcome this. But our research shows that an unfocused array of people better helps expose leaders' unknown unknowns. Tapping into a greater diversity of input by sourcing knowledge from a crowd consisting of many outsiders with diverse backgrounds helps leaders find the right problems. Second, use external crowds to address demand uncertainty. That is, to determine if you found the right solution to a problem. A good way to resolve demand uncertainty is to source knowledge from crowds consisting of extreme customers, people outside the organization who would intensely use your product or service and be most likely to recommend it to others, as well as those who would use it rarely, if at all. The heightened sensitivities of extreme users help leaders recognize and better connect with customer needs, beliefs, and desires. Honda did this when designing its successful Ridgeline pickup truck. Engineers questioned 2 types of extreme users: pickup truck lovers, specifically people who ran businesses out of them, such as electricians and landscapers, and occasional users, such as people who only use their trucks at weekend tailgates. From the truck lovers, the engineers discovered a general dislike for traditional tailgates. These customers wanted a tailgate that swung out and could detach to make cargo loading easier. From the weekend tailgaters, the engineers learned that a built-in ice cooler and an electrical outlet to plug in a TV or a mixer would come in handy. These ideas helped transform a good pickup truck into one of the most popular mid-sized trucks in the United States. Third, use internal crowds to address supply uncertainty. By supply uncertainty, we mean that even after you've figured out what people want, it isn't clear that you have the knowledge necessary to execute. Executing a new solution typically means solving a series of new problems that call for bits and pieces of know-how from varied sources. Though leaders often turn to their closest associates for ideas and expertise, a better approach is to source knowledge from people inside the organization they barely know, individuals characterized as weak ties. Established teams are liable to revert to the same old approaches when seeking the kinds of novel solutions that executing a new product or service tends to require. It makes more sense to look beyond your usual networks and tap people in other departments or business units.
Thanks, Chris. Another question is, do you follow what data is telling you or do you ignore it? This is a golden age of data in which new capabilities driven by data analytics promise to turbocharge companies' disruptive potential. But some innovation leaders overly defer to data and wind up with cultures in which other legitimate decision-making methods, logic, intuition, qualitative insights, take a back seat. Other leaders appreciate that path-breaking innovations are inherently contrarian, and evaluating them requires nuance and interpretation. These innovators sometimes ignore data altogether. Resolving this tension between making data-driven decisions and relying on intuition requires when to take which approach. Let's take a poll. How should innovation leaders engage with data? Should they A, forge new paths by exploring promising ideas supported by data, or B, forge new paths by exploring promising ideas unsupported by data?
All right, Rory, the results are in. 71% of people said forge paths by exploring promising ideas supported by data. 29% of people said forge paths by exploring promising ideas unsupported by data. What's the answer, Rory?
Great, thanks, Chris. We can stop sharing those polls now. Well, our research suggests you should actually lean in on data when making incremental improvements to existing innovations for current customers, but view it more skeptically when transforming products and services in the face of disruption or when introducing truly breakthrough offerings. Netflix, renowned for its data-driven decision-making, had one of its biggest hits ever when it ignored the data showing that 80s nostalgia fared poorly, as did programs featuring kids and actress Winona Ryder, and produced award-winning Stranger Things anyway. Leaders can protect potentially disruptive and new to the world innovations by adopting a discerning orientation toward data and a healthy skepticism about insights derived from data. For instance, while Netflix executives use data to inform their decisions when greenlighting programming, they don't use it as their sole criterion. You have to be very cautious not to get caught up in the math because you'll end up making the same thing over and over again, says Netflix's co-CEO and Chief Content Officer, Ted Sarandos. And the data just tells you what happened in the past. It doesn't tell you anything that will happen in the future. Such caution ensures that leaders don't rely on data drawn from existing products in established markets to evaluate unrelated innovations aimed at new markets. When Steve Jobs introduced the Macintosh computer, for instance, he leaned on his theory of technology, not the numbers. In the early 1980s, there was no data suggesting an overwhelming unmet demand for desktop computers. This also prevents innovations from withering on the vine due to unrealistic performance expectations.
All right, folks, here's another key question that's probably relevant to most of you. How do you mature a business without making it sluggish and bureaucratic? As organizations grow, leaders impose order and efficiency by adding levels of management, policies, and procedures. But over time, adding structure increases complexity, which makes organizations more bureaucratic and less flexible. So how can leaders balance this tension between efficiency and flexibility? One solution to this tension is to employ heuristics, or simple rules of thumb. Heuristics often get a bad rap. Research suggests they may neglect or misinterpret important critical information and lead to low performance. But our analysis found that heuristics can be a key to high performance. Rules of thumb provide efficiency in decision-making and problem solving by restricting the scope of possible solutions. At the same time, they enable flexibility by not specifying the details of the solution. Amazon's 2 pizza teams rule is a good example. If 2 pizzas aren't enough to feed a team, according to CEO Jeff Bezos, the team is too big. This rule is efficient because it's easy to remember and apply. It's flexible because it doesn't dictate things like who should be on the team, what team members should talk about, or for how long. Rules of thumb come in different varieties. Selection heuristics help managers cope with an abundance of choice by constraining the range of opportunities they consider. Procedure heuristics can guide growth pursuing processes such as how to enter new countries, how to make alliances, how to form partnerships, thus speeding action, conserving attention, and improving the reliability of opportunity capture. Priority heuristics help leaders avoid acceptable but lower value opportunities in favor of higher value alternatives. And because capturing growth opportunities typically requires internal coordination of limited resources, timing heuristics that specify a sequence or a pace can be advantageous, such as Apple's release a majority of new products every year, usually in September. Last point, be aware that rules that proved useful initially can become outdated. Heuristics should routinely be reviewed and pruned so they don't create a bureaucracy of their own. Okay, next question. How do you make new to world innovations comfortably familiar while still distinct? You ready for another poll? Let's do it. You're in charge of the introduction of a breakthrough technology. What should you emphasize? The familiar features of the new technology, or B, the novel features of the new technology? All right, 36% of you said the familiar features of the new technology, and 64% said the novel features of the new technology. Well, folks, to make you all feel good, the answer is both A and B, but at different times. So we can take down the poll and we'll move on. Novelty sells, you know that. But if products and services are perceived as too alien, customers may reject them. Thus, there's a delicate balance between novelty and familiarity. And when to stress one or the other is a tension every innovator must master. To manage this tension, innovators should begin by stressing similarities to existing products and services when introducing their own. While highlighting what's novel may work in established arenas where competitors try to one-up each other, it's less effective when introducing something new to the world. When a new product or technology gains a foothold, however, leaders should shift to emphasizing novelty. Once barriers to new user adoption have been toppled and customers are familiar with an innovation, they will be ready to focus on the features that distinguish it from its predecessors and competitors. Amazon and Barnes & Noble followed this sequence when introducing e-readers. First, they emphasized how the Kindle and Nook were similar to traditional books with features like next page buttons and animations that simulated a book page being turned. Later, they highlighted how e-readers were unique by drawing attention to features such as digital bookmarks, scrolling, and embedded dictionaries, which traditional books lack.
Thanks, Chris. Another question. Do you spend money on promoting your brand or solving someone else's problem? You launch an innovation and spend tons of money following the classic marketing playbook, only to have it flop in the marketplace. Should you have focused your efforts on advertising the brand's features and running sales promotions, or focused on how your innovation helps customers solve a particular problem perfectly? Well-designed purpose brands, which we defined as a brand that is inextricably linked to a particular customer job to be done, can sell themselves, enable premium pricing, and lock out competitors. But far more new brands fail than succeed because innovators spend more time thinking about their brand than thinking about the problems that customers face and how the brand aligns with the solutions they crave. Gojo Industries is an example of how a relentless focus on what Clayton Christensen called the job to be done can pay off. Gojo was founded during World War II after Goldie Lippman, a rubber plant worker in Akron, Ohio, couldn't get her hands clean without chafing or burning them. Her husband, Jerry, with the help of a local professor, invented a hand cleanser to get the job done. Customers liked the product, but found it too expensive, and Jerry soon figured out why. They were using more of the cleanser than necessary. So he invented and patented the first portion control hand cleaner dispenser, again focusing less on promotion or product and more on the customer's job to be done. Decades later, when Gojo discovered that its customers needed to sanitize hands more than remove grease and grime, it once again focused on the job to be done. The company invented Purell, which combined with its touch-free and counter-mount dispensing systems became ubiquitous during the COVID-19 pandemic. A final question. How do you keep supporters on board when you inevitably change course? Launching an ambitious new venture requires enormous support. Much of that support comes by selling investors, new employees, the media, and others on a visionary story and a promising strategic plan. But often when vision and strategy meet reality, leaders find they must pivot to a new plan. Such moves are filled with tension as leaders struggle to communicate the shift to stakeholders who bought into the initial plan. It pits consistency against change, and it is here that many leaders and many organizations falter. Our research identifies a set of tactics for maintaining stakeholder support during strategic pivots. Early on, leaders should avoid communicating specific solutions in favor of a compelling, visionary, but general rallying cry. Successful innovation leaders communicate by means of emotional appeals that underscore a larger aim. They promise to reach a destination and resist the urge to be precise about features and functionality. Microsoft is modernizing the workplace. LinkedIn is connecting the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful. Patagonia is in the business to save the planet. Big abstract ideas encourages audiences to see what they want to see and offer more wiggle room if a pivot is needed. If a course correction is necessary, leaders should signal continuity by explaining how the new plan ties to the original vision. People value consistency. Our analysis of media coverage and feedback from customers, partners, and investors shows that audiences view inconsistent organizations as less legitimate and ultimately less deserving of their support. But they're also less likely to register a deviation as significant if it seems aligned with previously articulated aims. The link between the new strategic direction and the initial pitch isn't always obvious, however. To maintain credibility and avoid being penalized, leaders need to make the connection explicit. This is what Steph Corey and Jen Rubio, co-founders of the luggage startup Away, did after realizing their first suitcases wouldn't be ready for Christmas as promised. Instead, they decided to produce a coffee table travel book that came with a gift card redeemable for a bag the next year. This major departure from their plan could easily have unnerved supporters. But the founders argued that while luggage was key to reaching their higher level goal of building a travel and lifestyle brand, the book fit too. Investors were convinced. Media outlets ran holiday gift buying features about a suitcase that didn't yet exist. Within a few weeks, 2,000 books and bags had been sold. Finally, once the pivot has taken place, leaders should be conciliatory and empathetic to stakeholders who may feel abandoned. Employees and customers are more likely to remain loyal if leaders act like they care about their plight and offer clear guidance about how the change will affect everyone. All too often, though, leaders are afraid of showing weakness or losing stakeholders amid a reboot, and so they make the change without apologizing or admitting they were wrong. Instead of preparing audiences for a change, they spring it on them. Only when stakeholders react do they apologize. By then, it's too late, and they find themselves in the defensive.
So let's wrap up. Innovation is never easy, but leaders who can thoughtfully consider the questions we've posed above and manage the tensions embedded within them can tackle some of innovation's toughest trade-offs and significantly improve the odds of success for the organizations. The key to this endeavor is to transform the tensions from reductive to productive. to make them something that can help and be harnessed as leaders seek new opportunities for growth and innovation. Our message isn't to work harder. The leaders that we have met, like you, are already exceptionally hardworking. Instead, our message is to work smarter by addressing innovation's inevitable tensions in the right way, by anticipating the tensions that will arise and facing them head on, thus reducing the risk of having to halt innovation efforts and better positioning the organization to overcome crippling complications. Thanks again for taking time to be with us today. Elizabeth, I think we are ready for Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for that presentation. We've got some great questions coming in from the audience, and I'd just like to remind the audience we will continue to take your questions for the remainder of the hour, and you can just submit those by typing them into the questions module. So to kick things off, you've discussed 8 very different tensions. Are there any common patterns for addressing them?
I'll try to take this one. That's a great question. We saw a couple different patterns. One is to stop vacuuming behind the scenes when you're giving a presentation. No, we see 3 different pathways. We call them sequence, separate, and then synthesize. So sometimes you need to sequence the solution. So think about the familiar versus novel. When you're introducing a new technology, initially, you want to emphasize the familiar so that people can grab hold on to those features that they're comfortable with. But after the technology, the product or service takes hold, then you want to shift to the novel to make sure that these wonderful new features are not being overlooked. So that's sequencing, that's one pattern. And then what you see is separation. You see that in questions such as, should we adhere to the data or should we ignore the data? For existing products and services where there's some incremental innovation, adhering to the data is pretty important. But for new to the world innovations, you probably want to ignore the data. And then finally, we have synthesis. This is where a single solution seems to satisfy both parts of the tension. These heuristics or simple rules are a good example of this particular path and solution. So take, for example, hire talented locals. You're interested in going into new geographic markets and you've got that simple rule, hire talented locals. Now notice that gives you some guidance and efficiency so that we're not winging things or we're not just overriding things from the past, but within that limited structure of hire talented locals, there's a lot of flexibility to adjust and adapt in the current situation. You may rely on your board of directors to find those talented locals. You may rely on online resources, or you may rely on something completely different. So those are sort of 3 paths that we see.
Okay, thank you. And then, staying on that same drift of just looking across the, all of the sort of 8 key tensions, if you're considering the particular business context that leaders are facing at the moment, heightened global tensions, the perception that globalization is diminishing, concerns about inflation, continued supply chain issues, are there particular tensions of the 8 that you think may be more challenging to manage in this environment?
Rory, do you want to take a first pass on that and then I can jump in, or?
Yeah, happy to. I think, the way you frame this, Elizabeth, is great, because I think when you start looking across, the tensions, not just the ones that we talked about, but the ones that exist in the world, there's really no easy solutions, right? I think the temptation here is to jump to a trade-off and to try to say, I'm going to pick path A or path B and just go with it. And the message of our research is really, it's not about doing that. It's about harnessing those tensions effectively. And so in the context that you're talking about, when I think about a company thinking about trying to differentiate or borrow from a competitor, I mean, if anything, the pace of innovation, the global experiences that we're seeing makes identifying who your competitors are maybe even harder today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. It's just constantly changing. And so thinking about parallel play as a way to sort of engage that tension and harness it productively, as opposed to just choosing to differentiate or just choosing to borrow, I think is a lot more effective way to go. But thank you for framing it that way, because we sort of see, once you sort of get an idea out there, you start seeing everything else through the lens of that idea, for better or for worse.
I would just add to it that, organizations often attempt to build up these core competencies, these core capabilities. that are refined over time through incremental use and additional contexts. The more we do something, the better we get at it. The better we get at it, the more we want to utilize it in different parts of the organization. Well, the twist is that these core competencies can become core rigidities. Like the very thing that allowed you to succeed can actually cause your demise. And so I think, you know, we wrote this book for large established organizations, small startups, and nonprofits too. But I think large organizations where there's a lot of path dependencies, there's a lot of history, there's a lot of structure, may be particularly challenged to make some of these changes. Their history can be very constraining in many situations.
Understood. Yeah, and sort of, again, I think that segues a little bit into a question about the one of the early questions about being disciplined about opportunities. Are there ways to take a less than ideal early opportunity because the business really needs the revenue without being pulled off course by that customer?
Yeah, it's challenging because, you know, I'll take the context of maybe a smaller organization that is that lives and dies by cash. It's hard to turn down immediate revenue when you've got to make payroll next week. The challenge is if you jump on these opportunistic opportunities, pretty soon you're down 3 or 4 rabbit holes, and it's difficult to come back and reverse course. So it's hard, and I recognize this. You know, having worked in a startup, I check the cash balance every day. I understand this. It's very difficult to be disciplined. You know, in one particular case, I was working with a Singapore startup that was trying to go up to Japan, and they realized that they weren't going to be seen as very legitimate. So they said, well, let's go to Taiwan first to get some reference customers, because again, a lot of organizations have these liabilities of newness. You've got to overcome these inherent liabilities. So they go to Taiwan to get some reference customers, but the Japanese said, well, what we really want is we want to see some US reference customers. So they used their foray into Taiwan to then go into the US just so that they could get an Inc. business card and then pitch back to Japan. So it's about understanding, and as one person told us, often a pecking order of nations. There's often a sequence in these opportunity captures, and realizing that one can often build to the other. Sometimes it's geography, sometimes it's size, sometimes it's something else. But seeing the larger picture and be fairly disciplined at the front end is very important.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And let's see, so many questions. Pop through here and get some good ones. Here's somebody who was hoping you might clarify one of your points. Who's asking, do I understand it right, that it makes sense to switch from follower strategy, that is borrow, to a pioneer strategy, differentiate, during the development of a new offer? I think you might want to restate the sort of borrow versus differentiate point.
Yeah,
there.
That's great. That's a great question. Yeah, and so we sort of use this analogy of parallel play among preschoolers to sort of make the point about the sequencing that happens oftentimes. And I think the reason we use that metaphor is because, you know, in competitive strategy, we oftentimes think about doing things different from our competitors. But then you have to ask yourself the question of, well, who do you mean by your competitors? And so in our case, we're looking at other peers who are oftentimes as small and as new as you are in this new competitive space. And the argument is that these are actually resources that we can learn from and borrow from as we work our way to a successful and lucrative business model. And so the sequencing is really about, rather than sort of viewing those, you know, competitive peers as traditional competitors and trying to distinguish our offerings from them early on, we risk sort of running ourselves down a blind alley and differentiating something to a customer that we don't even know is going to care about that particular thing. So the argument is, you know, early on, put aside differentiation and borrow the best ideas from those peers instead, and get to that next step in terms of developing your business model. Even when you get to the end, right, it's about pausing and watching and waiting, because if you sort of lock in that business model too early, you miss out on unanticipated customers and unintended product uses, and those can be very, very lucrative.
Okay. And we have a number of questions related to your points about data. I think I have a feeling SMR's audience, well, obviously, as your poll showed, lean towards being data-driven. won't innovators exploring new markets want to seek out data on the needs of potential customers? You sort of indicated that that was the case when you might not want to rely on data so much, but there might be a little more nuance to your point.
Yeah, we thought this one might be a little bit more controversial, right? Because it's sort of making an argument, hey, there might be times when you might want to, go against or ignore the data rather than to defer to the data. And we want to make the point that, it's important to think about this as a circumstance contingency. We have great quotes from innovative leaders, Steve Jobs introducing the iPad, Henry Ford saying if I'd ask people what they wanted, they would say faster horses. And so the argument here is that when you lean on data for truly new to the world innovations, it's likely to make something that a customer wants as opposed to something a customer could never before imagine. And so pushing it in that direction a little bit, especially when you think about a potentially disruptive offering or a new to the world offering, that oftentimes it makes sense to treat it more as almost a theory of a customer as opposed to the data of a customer. And so that's sort of our argument. And obviously, you have a company like Netflix that has all of the data in the world on our potential viewing habits and demand, and they sort of know everything about us. Why would a smart, sophisticated company like that sometimes not want to lean on the data or not give the people that are making their shows access to all their data? Well, the answer is because you'll make out the same thing over and over again. So we understand that this is controversial, and we want to make the point that it's very much a circumstance contingent.
Right. Okay. Got it. And then speaking of disruptive innovation, one of our audience members asked whether, how does the concept of disruptive innovation tie into your idea about innovation tensions? And I know that's a little bit of a softball. Rory, I know that you've got, had worked with Clayton Christensen in the past, and was one of the thinkers who's helped shape your ideas here. So maybe we can kind of expand this question into just looking at, who are some of the thinkers, like Christensen for sure, who have helped you shape these ideas?
Yeah, maybe I can start, Chris, and then you can jump in. So, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, Clay Christensen is a big influence on some of these ideas. I worked with him at the Harvard Business School for the last, several years. He obviously passed away a couple years ago, and we taught the same course. And I think both Chris and I were heavily influenced by some of the ideas that we read that he developed many years ago. So you'll see in the book, for example, obviously this one about data and thinking about potentially disruptive innovations as being the ones where you actually want to, not so much defer to the data would be a great example. But I think the other example for us is actually one of his other ideas that gets a little bit less maybe play as disruptive innovation, and that's the jobs to be done idea. So when we talked about whether it's better to promote your brand or solve someone else's problem, Clay referred to that as the customer's job to be done, and you're sort of hiring our product or a service to do that job for you. And so we actually, one of the last things I got a chance to write with him was this notion of building on that and thinking about how that connects to brands. And so you'll see some of those ideas in the book. And then, of course, Chris and I were heavily influenced by Kathy Eisenhart. Maybe I'll let Chris say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, Kathy Eisenhart was my advisor in the PhD program at Stanford, and it was also Rory's advisor in the same PhD program at Stanford. That's how we met. Rory and I met in our PhD program, and I think, again, we're self-selecting into a program where people ask very process-oriented questions, where they're adopting more of an inductive approach, where we're going to see how the soup is made rather than just assuming that we know the answer and come up with an hypothesis and test it and confirm it or disconfirm it. We want to see how stuff unfolds, how leaders are really grappling with fundamental tensions, or as other people might have said, conundrums, puzzles. This is what executives deal with every day. And I think it's what made Clay so successful. It's certainly what makes Kathy so successful, is there's not an easy solution to this at all. So when you pose the question, what should you do here? People are like, yeah, what would you do? Like, how do I deal with that? And it's messy and it's difficult. People often assume that inductive research is just easy. Just go and interview people and listen to their story. No, nothing could be farther from the truth. You're trying to understand these patterns that are emerging in different cases at different times with different leaders, with different processes. And that's a very, very rigorous process. but both Clay and Kathy have been exemplars in this field. I just, Kathy in particular, we talked a little about the simple rules and heuristics. I mean, she's been dealing with this tension of efficiency versus flexibility for quite some time in many different areas, but it's a very, very powerful one. And so Rory and I are indebted to these intellectual pioneers that have had a great imprint on us.
Great, thank you. Now, another member of our audience wants to know, do your sort of, they call it, the questioner calls them rules, but these questions, tensions, and your advice for dealing with them, does that apply equally to B2B as well as B2C? Noting that most of your examples were a little bit more in the B2C space, and if not, what might be a little bit different?
Yeah, I think what we would say is that, the traditional ways to sort of categorize the world are, big company, small company, or, B2B versus B2C. And we're obviously trying to build some new theories and frameworks. And what we want to do is we want to create, generalizable things that apply to all kinds of different people. And so I think you might have to do a little bit more work to apply to one versus the other. I always think about the customers, when we think about the customer's job to be done. For a consumer, right, there's many different ones. So that's sort of the bad news. The good news is if you're into a B2B environment, you kind of know what the job is to be done, which is the business of business is, after all, business. And so companies want to make more money in the way that they're structured to make money. And so in some cases that simplifies the effort a little bit, because we understand what a customer's job to be done is when we have a business customer. So we would say that maybe is not quite the way we would categorize the world. We want these to be applicable and generalizable to all of them, but there are certainly some differences when we think about application.
Okay. Yeah, just to maybe add on to that point, you think about some of the stuff that B2B is dealing with. I mean, think about sort of alliances, partnerships. I think about Yahoo's simple rules for partnerships. Don't do a deal that jeopardizes the user experience. No exclusive deals. The product or service must be free. So the concept actually applies equally there, and the outcomes are just as important. It's not only, in that particular case, the simple rules, not only clarity, but I think you're also trying to help people, whether it's B2B or B2C, get aligned and also be empowered. So there may be different contexts, but we intentionally wrote the book in a way that would be applicable and generalizable across a lot of contexts. So thanks for the question.
Okay, great. And here's a question that introduces maybe another tension or maybe the specific, but I think it is something that innovators do struggle with a lot. So how do you manage that you want to be sure your idea is sufficiently tested, which needs time and resources, versus the need to be fast and lean? And I'm not sure if you would.
Maybe let me just take a quick pass, and you're right, Elizabeth, this is kind of in the tensions and it's kind of outside a little bit. What we didn't mention explicitly is this need for experimentation. Now, the hallmark of any good experiment is invest a little, learn a lot. Invest a little, learn a lot. Now, notice what I said, invest a little, learn a lot, not perform a lot. So the whole goal of learning is actually to increase variance. The goal of performance is to reduce variance. So when people are trying new things, whether it's an MVP, minimal viable product, or a prototype, or some sort of experiment, we have to remember that the goal is not to perform a lot. The goal is actually to learn a lot. Invest a little, learn a lot. And that's challenging because when it doesn't perform very well, then key resources are stripped: people, money, charters, etc. And so while we don't explicitly get into that in the book, this idea of effective experimentation is very important. But again, it's really critical to remember that the key outcome that we're after is learning. I don't know, Rory, what would you add?
Yeah, I mean, I would add too is the inevitability of being wrong, right? Even if you are testing and experimenting, you're going to be wrong at some point, right? There's great data on the number of businesses that have changed course over time, and that's why this tension of how do you keep supporters on board when you inevitably change course is so important. So you're going to be wrong at some point, but you're going to make some claims to get those stakeholders on board initially. How do you keep them on board when you inevitably change course, when you inevitably enter a market and realize that you've got something wrong? And I think this is this is a thing that sort of the lean startup has not dealt as much with, which is how do you sort of manage the stakeholder part of inevitably being wrong. And I think a lot of people have said, you just need to move to whatever the customer wants. Well, that's fine, but you've got partnerships, you've got investors, you've got the media, you've got employees that have all bought into some initial idea. When you change course, as you inevitably will, how do you keep them on board? And so I think that's a really important consideration, because you still need the resources when you are inevitably going to be wrong.
Can I make one final point on this, just because I think it's such a broad, applicable, and important point. We often will refer to that, what Rory just described, as sort of the paradox of the pivot. People are excited about your idea, but your idea is going to change. So how do you keep them on board? This idea of pivoting has been so overused during the last couple of years. It was overused before that, but it's been especially overused during the last couple of years. But I often like to remind people, what sport does that come from? Now, I'm from Carolina, so you could probably guess, but it comes from basketball, right? You've got a leg that's spinning around, but what's going on with the other leg? People forget when you're talking about the pivot, there's actually two legs, right? And what's going on with that other leg is it's actually planted. So the point is, the plant allows the pivot, the stability allows the change. If you look at highly resilient individuals, people that are very adaptable, there is something stable that allows them to change. Now, this is not in our context in the book, but if you look at the personal level, that stability may come from your family, your faith, your friends, but something has got to stay core. And that's kind of what Rory's talking about, like in his response, is you're pointing to something higher level. That's that plant leg. So we're not just winging it. We're not just dumping everything from the past. So I like to just remind people there's two legs there.
Right. Thank you. I will never think of that term the same way again. I will always think of somebody turning and taking a shot. Now, two questions related to sort of big company and structure and innovating. They're kind of related here. One is, for large companies looking to incubate new ventures, how far can they stretch from the core business? Can new business and innovation be entirely different from the core business, is the first question. And then, related to that is, when capturing growth opportunities, you mentioned, stay focused initially. Does that mean you would recommend in a large company environment like that, that innovation comes from specialized teams?
Let me see if I can maybe address one or two of those questions with maybe a slightly different point. As organizations grow and mature, they just inevitably become more complex. More teams, more structures, more processes, more services, more geographies, et cetera. It's just a natural byproduct of growth. It's actually a good thing. But people forget that in a dynamic environment, that structure that is very enabling can become very constraining. And that's because that structure, like everything else in an organization, it has a useful life. There's actually an accounting term for this. We call it depreciation. It actually depreciates. I mean, think about it we just step back, like, why does structure, like policies, procedures, manuals, why do we even create them in the first place? It's usually because something went wrong and we don't want to repeat that mistake. Well, that's really rational. Well, again, in a dynamic environment, that structure might have been useful a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but we need to make sure that we are updating structure to reflect the here and now. And that's tricky. The analogy that I'll often use is good companies that grow, they talk about M&A, mergers and acquisitions. Better companies talk about M&A and D, mergers and acquisitions and divestitures, because you can't just add. You got to cut to grow. But nobody really cuts structure in organizations as they're trying to innovate and change. What they do is they just add to it. We were working with Dow Chemical. Dow had a 2,000-page manual for its acquisitions. So if you were a business unit leader, you come to Dow and say, hey, we want to do an acquisition. They're like, okay, fine, here you go. And they drop all this documentation on your desk, and these leaders would just start acting on automatic pilot, just assuming that their acquisition was like all the other ones in the past. Dow had to strip big pieces of the methodology out to force more mindful engagement. That's really tough. So that's not a direct answer to the question, but it is certainly something that all leaders in big organizations face. How to simplify complexity.
And Chris, I'll just add there what you were talking about earlier with the capabilities. When you're a startup, any customer is a good customer, right? I'm just so excited that they're willing to pay me for the offering that I'm developing. And as soon as you get to be a large, established, successful organization, it doesn't look like that anymore, right? It looks like, well, that customer is a little bit fickle, and they're a little bit, kind of price sensitive, and they're a little bit, they want something different. And so that's the scary part, is as you grow, you stop looking at the world like a startup looks at the world. You can do that, but I think that would suggest a little bit more separation when you're trying to do something truly new to the world that customers haven't seen before.
Right. Okay, thank you. And let's see, we have time for just about one more question here. And this is an interesting one. How important is market knowledge in the innovation process? Do you see the needs for new kinds of roles, such as market entrepreneurs, who can complement technical roles? Especially assuming those technical roles, we don't understand the market or customers as well.
Rory, do you want me to take a first pass, or do you want to go?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I'm doing a fair amount of work with business accelerators. These are 3-month intensive entrepreneurship programs that are popping up around the world. If you use Dropbox, Airbnb, they came out of Y Combinator. At the best accelerators, what they'll say to people is no implementing, no coding the first month. And you're like, wait a minute, these are 3-month programs, and you're saying no implementing, no coding the first month? Yeah, that's what we're telling you. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to expose you to our broad base of network of mentors. At Techstars, it's not uncommon for you to be exposed to up to 75 unique mentors in the first 3 weeks. They actually call this mentor whiplash because your head is spinning. But what happens after 10, 20, 30 of these meetings with different mentors is you start to see the thread and the feedback, and you're like, oh, that's it. That's it. Now I get the value proposition. So the idea is we slow you down temporarily to speed you up later. And this idea of exposing to lots of diverse people is a deliberate mechanism so that executives don't shut down search. We often talk about a lot of biases, but a real fundamental bias is executives shut down search too quickly. They're like, got it, I got the insight. Oh, I talked to that person. Yep, I'm ready to go. No, you got to force search open. That's what the 75 mentors is designed to do. So the quick way to respond is you need to have lots of feelers out, lots of little periscopes helping you make sure that you're going from something that's decent to something that's good to something that's better to something that's really good, like really terrific. So I take a page from the Accelerator Playbook and expose yourself to lots of broad mentors in diverse areas.
Great. Anything from you, Rory, in 30 seconds? No?
Yeah, 30 seconds. We've got a story about Henri Seydoux and Parrot drones. And if you look at the projections for the different applications of drone technology, it was all over the map. So we could absolutely use some folks who are becoming experts at market knowledge.
Great, thank you. All right, well, we are out of time. So thank you, Chris and Rory, very much for spending time with us today and sharing the insights from your new book. To our audience, I'd like to say thank you for being here with us, and hope you'll join us again next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.